Okay. The order is going to be the state's counterclaim, the fiscal discipline disadvantage, and then the case to it. The question you should ask yourself at the end of this debate is, even if the states aren't going to do a perfect job in implementing the 1AC, and even if there might be minor issues, are those issues worth taking the risk of tyranny throughout the United States, a lack of effectiveness in overall policies without a possibility for future reform, and the possibility that the economy could be terminally damaged by the 1AC? The simple answer is going to be no. The argument about why the cooperative federalism would be enhanced by combining the two options is not refuting any of the points made in the negative block. The first being that this would not solve the spending disadvantage, which means there is a massive disadvantage to combining the two efforts. The second point was that cooperative federalism is different than the McGinnis evidence, which talks about a clear distinction between federal government and state policies so that state and local governments can experiment and change so that the federal government could then model and create a better policy ultimately. This is a unique net benefit to the counterplan because it allows for an experimentation not possible in the app to ultimately produce the most effective result down the road. This is especially important given the only argument on the affirmative is that we should take a long-term vision and assessing the way in which we desire a policy. The last argument that they make is that the states have political incentives, or rather the states lack political incentives necessary to identify these problems and create solutions. This is denied both by the McGinnis evidence and the Lindhorst evidence in the 1NC, which both seem to indicate that they had incentives to stop federal policies, and even if they didn't, even if these policies were ineffective, they would face criticism and thus would be simply serving as a laboratory for change for future federal government policies. More specifically on the fiscal discipline disadvantage, you have to realize that the argument about jobs and the economy and how even if education is increased goes unanswered by the 1AR. This means that even if all of these policies are effective in the long term, any risk that the entitlement spending of the affirmative is a new policy, as discussed in our Moore evidence in 2009 that isn't directly responded to, means that the economy is going to face massive budgetary problems that will only take a risk of decreasing its effectiveness. The Silk evidence is a piece of evidence you should remember quite vividly throughout the debate because it puts things in perspective. Even though little Johnny might not be paying the most attention in class, it probably doesn't matter when you're faced with the risk of increasing AIDS, disease, other nationalistic problems because the economy of the United States is beginning to decline. Even if you believe a collapse is impossible, there isn't a reason as to why the affirmative plan can help the economy in the short term, which means you should err on the side of caution and simply let the states foot the bill. On the case debate, I'm still not sure which piece of evidence he's referring to in making all these claims about the job market for superintendents, but our evidence seems pretty conclusive on the point that there is simply not enough, which means that there is simply not enough leadership for these programs to be implemented. There's only a chance that the states can solve this problem.
Okay. It'll be the case debate, the spending disadvantage, and then the counterclaim. There are still over 200 schools ready to make the transition today. Those schools that already have superintendents that are ready to make the switch, and there are tons of PhDs and masters waiting for jobs, which means we would just provide more potential jobs in the future. Regardless, there's only a risk that the current programs can switch over to community schools and we'd be net beneficial in the future. And remember, with our case, we face a problem with our economy, with our style of governance, just like federalism in the last speech, with our education, and most of all with our youth. This cause came from economic disparities and short-sighted policies. He wants you to vote negative for another short-sighted concern that our budget might be too strained. It's time that we stop being short-sighted and focus on the only sustainable way to improve the fundamentals and improve our quality of lives in the future, the spending deed. He's already conceded the argument to me that the only way to address the true fundamentals of the economy is to have educational reform with an emphasis on improving the economy in the future so that we don't have blips in our economy like the 9/11 recession or the dot-com crisis. He says the new policy would still be unpredictable, but that does not affect our plan. We're talking about whether or not we should affirm it. So even if the budget gets strained in the future, if you're voting affirmative, you're voting to guarantee funding to community schools. Also, don't let states foot the bill. They're in just as much debt, if not more, than the federal government percentage-wise. It's important the federal government take a leadership role and ignore the naysayers like the negative. If they can spend $1 trillion on the stimulus bill, which largely went to trivial projects, they can spend a few $billion on the children and the future of the country. Lastly, the counterplan. Maybe the 1 versus 1 debate confused Andrew because I think the last time someone went for a federalism argument was in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The permutation. He has still yet to come up with a solid reason why cooperative federalism would not be good enough. If there are distinctions and those are important, that's fine. But those distinctions are not being respected now. Medicaid, Medicare give block grants to states wrapped in a form of wrapping that has specific instructions on how the states must use those funds. They have no choice in the matter. There's no respect for the line between federal and state powers. Instead, we have to use this opportunity to cooperate with the state governments. The permutation is a specific example of how we can slowly give states the rights back and change our fortune to get rid of this tyranny that might be inevitable. Also, the federal government is the key actor. The political incentives argument, I'm afraid you misunderstood. States lack the political incentives to maintain a fully functioning, fully funding, fully effective policy for schools. They will cut corners. They will change their policies. He brought up that their laboratory policies, because states can actually experiment with different types of policies. I told you exactly what they'll experiment with. They'll experiment with budget cuts, with undermining our youth, and with degrading our education system. Also, the Constitution, again, encourages general welfare. It's important the federal government take the lead. They're to blame in this situation, and they're the only ones that can solve it.